If you get 5 anarchists in a room and you ask them what anarchism is, you'll get 8 different answers. Partly because it's hard to envision a different way of organizing society when we're immersed in non-voluntary hierarchies, and partly because anarchists generally don't do a very good job of articulating their ideas. I'm more anarchist adjacent, anarcho-pragmatist if you're into the whole hyphenated thing. So rather than launch into lengthy exposition on Proudhon, Spooner, and Kropotkin, I'm going to start with Larry Niven's short story, A Cloak of Anarchy, which captures one of the core problems with the popular understanding of anarchism. Published in 1972, Cloak of Anarchy is set in a near future where the automobile has been phased out. The big knots of freeway interchanges in cities have been turned into parks, specifically free parks, where everything is permitted except violence against others. Anything else is good to go in the park, and people flock to them to enjoy the anything goes atmosphere. But the entire park is monitored by small flying drones referred to as cop's eyes. Gold dots against blue, basketball-sized, 12 feet up. Each a television eye and a sonic stunner. Each a hookup to police headquarters. They were there to enforce the law of the park. No violence. No hand to be raised against another. And no other laws whatsoever. Life was often entertaining in a free park. The park has the appearance, the cloak of anarchy, made possible by a minimalist state apparatus operating within narrowly defined parameters. But an anarchist named Ron Cole has a plan to disable the cop's eyes. He manages to do it, and contrary to his expectations, the free park descends into savagery while our narrator and his party scurry around, trying to avoid getting caught up in the escalating mayhem. Scantily clad women flaunting their sexuality are suddenly in real danger. Satirical jokers are subjected to physical attacks, and little juntas form and start seizing resources. They had taken over the fountain. When someone came to get a drink, the tall ash-blonde one would step forward with his arm held stiffly out, palm forward. He had a wide mouth and a grin that might otherwise have been infectious, and a deep, echoing voice. He would intone, "Go back, none may pass here but the immortal Cthulhu," or something equally silly. Trouble was, they weren't kidding, or they were kidding, but they wouldn't let anyone have a drink. Things continue to degenerate until more cop's eyes arrive, stun everyone, and when they awake, it's back to the idyllic state of freedom made possible by the nudging of behavioral parameters policed by unobtrusive drones, prompting Ron to conclude, "I was wrong. Anarchy isn't stable. It comes apart too easily." While you could argue that this is a reflection of the assumptions that come with a cultural mindset of hierarchies and coercion more than an inherent flaw in the basic theory of anarchism, this does illustrate one of the core struggles that anarchist political theorists have in attempting to deal with those issues. So first we have to skip over all the high-minded philosophizing and start in the dirt. Anarchy doesn't mean chaos, it just means an absence of rulers. But the lack of rulers doesn't mean there are no rules. For example, if you, the viewers of this channel, and I are somehow the last surviving people on Earth, and I say, I think we should establish up front that we won't tolerate raping and murdering. That shit is right out. I think we'd all agree on that. But that doesn't make me the leader. We just agreed not to be assholes to each other to a basic level of decent human interaction. We're de facto anarchists. Of course, this only works if everyone involved is on the same page. When dealing with people who are eager to use force to impose their way on unwilling people, you have to treat them according to their nature. Anarchism isn't anti-structure or anti-organization, but anti-coercive hierarchy. It recognizes that any exercise of authority through force has, at its core, the desire to exert power over others. When you strip away the ideology and the legal pretensions, it always comes down to the exertion of power for its own sake. What the many variations of anarchism have in common is the attempt to disperse authority horizontally instead of vertically. It acknowledges that sometimes someone needs to be in charge of a task or a project, but it's voluntary authority based on skill and narrowly confined to that expertise. Or put another way, if we want to build a palace, we need an architect to design it and a foreman to organize the work. But we don't need a king to live in it. Cloak of Anarchy never gets this far. Its anarchist character is fairly shallow in his philosophy, just a milquetoast liberal trying to be edgy, not really having an idea of how a stateless, non-hierarchical society would function, but assuming it will just manifest in the absence of the current authorities. Probably why he abandons it so quickly by the end of the story. But real-world anarchists have definite ideas about how we get there and what it looks like. The catch is there's a lot of disagreement between innumerable anarcho-whatever offshoots. Now let's look at Pierre-Joseph Proudhon for just a bit. He's generally credited as the first person to self-identify as an anarchist and develop the foundation of the branch generally known as mutualism. In his mutualism, individuals interact as co-equal producers. They can join into federations, and he argued for and tried to establish parallel banking institutions that would facilitate credit and exchange outside of state control. But there's no mechanism of coercion. All associations and exchanges are voluntary, consensual, not compelled by threat of force. Communism is inequality, but not as property is. Property is the exploitation of the weak by the strong. Communism is the exploitation of the strong by the weak. Sounding almost a little Randian there. While Marx and the self-described communists saw a need for a transitional phase into communism, the anarchists, Peter Kropotkin perhaps most famously on this point, believed that property and the state must be abolished simultaneously. The communists thought that this was woolly, wishful thinking and argued that the revolution needed to be organized and directed to succeed. Mikhail Bakunin had some things to say about that, but we'll get there in a bit. First, I want to address one of the big splits today. Anarchism is by its nature fragmented, but two of the most vocal and well-known variations on the modern American landscape are attached to these two flags: anarcho-communism and anarcho-capitalism. I don't think you can be anarcho-anything else, not really. Communism, at least the Marxist framework that dominates communist thinking, requires the use of force by people deeming themselves to be in charge, whether during the transitional phase after the inevitable collapse of capitalism or to force that collapse, which may not be nearly as inevitable as they thought. Anarcho-capitalists really mean property rights more than the economic system of capitalism with market-dependent wage labor and all that entails. Or as David Friedman, one of that ideology's best-known proponents, explains,
it's a society which does not have a government and does use private property and trade to coordinate. So if you think about the most extreme pro-free market position you're used to, which says, well, all the government should do is police, courts, and national defense, anarcho-capitalism is carrying the argument one step farther and replacing the fundamental government functions with market functions.
This is using capitalism as a shorthand for private property and markets. But those things existed long before the capitalist economic system, which relies not only on property in terms of things, but capital, including the private ownership of productive assets like mines and factories, the productive capacity of a society, and those private owners pay wages to the laborers that work them while keeping the profits. The ownership of capital is not possession like the ownership of your private home or the contents of your pockets, but an abstract legal concept of ownership which in turn requires a state-like mechanism to enforce. You could organize it more like mutualism, with all the industry structured as worker-owned cooperatives but still trying to make a profit in competition with other cooperatives, and disputes settled case by case through arbitration and, maybe on rare occasions, little armed clashes. But it would be a different economic structure with different dynamics than the capitalism we're used to. Hyphenated anarchism, like most hyphenated things, strikes me as mostly a rhetorical dodge. And that isn't necessarily a problem, because anarchism itself allows for a broad range of wildly different forms of social organization and association. We don't have to agree, we just have to let each other live our own lives as we see fit, which sadly often seems harder to implement in practice, leading to the use of force to compel others to accept one's assumptions. Bringing me back to Bakunin. He was vehemently anti-capitalist and recognized that the state props up that system, and he was fully on board with violence as a legitimate tool for overthrowing the established order. But he tangled with the Marxists over that central point of state power. While he agreed with some of the communists that organization was required for the revolution, he believed that any rule by a minority was inherently corrupting, and he feared that the Marxist state of the proletariat would become a state over the proletariat. Point for Bakunin. Similarly, we have Kropotkin's view that the state cannot be used to emancipate the people. Property and the state must be abolished together. Sidebar: is anarchism leftist? It's common to put anarchists on the left, but libertarians on the right, though they tend to have a lot of overlap. I try to avoid the left-right categories for several reasons, not least because it doesn't make much sense to categorize modern political philosophies based on where some Frenchmen decided to sit in the 18th century. Back then, the anti-establishment, anti-monarchist factions sat on the left side of the assembly hall and jeered anyone that opposed them to the other side of the room. Right wing became associated with supporting the king and, more broadly, conservative and traditionalist attitudes, while left wing became shorthand for liberal or anti-establishment more generally. Just one of many irksome things about the modern world for which we can thank the French. But today the left is broadly identified with a basket of neoliberal and socialist ideologies, both of the Marxist and Social Democrat variety, the latter of which has become the operating system of the Western world, though to varying degrees depending on which country you're in. The left, at least that particular incarnation of the left, is the establishment. Rather than left-right, an authoritarian libertarian axis is more informative in modern politics, or in this case, a simple establishment anti-establishment axis. Anarchists are by definition anti-establishment. They mean to do away with it entirely. Now we come to some of the practical questions and how they're addressed both by anarchist theorists and fiction writers, which frankly are pretty much the same thing. So, laws can be broadly interpreted as any widely accepted rules that a society lives by, not necessarily something bickered over by delegates, written down on fancy paper and signed by some figurehead with a ceremonial pen backed by a paramilitary force. We can just agree not to kill each other and we have a law broadly defined. If someone violates it, we all disapprove mightily. But what do we actually do about it? AnCaps argue that the market will work it out. There will be demand for security forces of some kind, and the market will provide with a non-state solution. Cloak of Anarchy riffs on this. Right, so you can buy theft and murder insurance, and the insurance companies hire a police force. The client carries a credit card. Suppose the robber steals the card too. He can't use it, he doesn't have the right retina prints. But if the client doesn't have the credit card, he can't sick the cops on the thief. Oh, a noticeable pause. Well, on a philosophical level, anarchism is an uncompromising idea. No rulers. Not a little government that taxes you to maintain the roads and otherwise stays out of the way. Not one that keeps an army just in case the Hun tries to invade. No coercive state at all for anything. But this runs into problems of practical implementation, not only in terms of when and how to employ necessary violence, but also the production and distribution of goods. When Proudhon and Kropotkin were writing about decentralized, localized industries in the first half of the 19th century, it was counter to the path that industrialization was following. Factories were becoming more centralized because they had to. The technology of the time meant that if you wanted to mass-produce goods, you needed a lot of people working on a lot of machines under one roof. This carried on through most of the 20th century, culminating in mega factories like Ford's River Rouge plant that unloaded ore from lake freighters on one end and shat cars out the other, and the factory cities built in the Soviet Union during Stalin's rapid industrialization push, many of them facilitated by Ford. The idea of local decentralized industry would have sounded utopian and silly for most of the century, as though Ford or General Electric could go artisanal, terribly inefficient at best. But industrial technology is now approaching a point where we can start to see viable paths to decentralizing industries into smaller, more localized forms. On the extreme end, of course, we have additive manufacturing methods, 3D printing, metal sintering, and the like. But setting that all aside, one guy with a CNC machine can do work that used to take a whole shop. A lot of AnCaps draw on this, but it's basically taking the ideas about local ownership of Proudhon and draping them over modern tech that actually makes it viable in a technological society. Of course, goods would be more expensive, but the incentive would shift toward higher quality and longevity. For example, your major appliances are not meant to be repaired when they break. you're expected to get a new one. Without the constant need to feed next product into the mouth of consumerism, the incentives shift in favor of better stuff. But it would be a shock. Most people in the developed world have no idea how cheap things like food and clothing are today relative to most of human history. It's great for us on the top of that slope, but not so much for sweatshop workers and slaves in the cobalt mines. But there's another benefit to decentralized industry besides the moral factor of not using slave labor to produce cheap goods for wealthy countries. As our industrial technology gets more advanced, more complex, it becomes more fragile. One mediocre technician with a CNC machine can produce a wider range of components faster and with greater precision than a skilled machinist with a lathe and mill. However, it takes a much smaller failure of equipment to completely stop everything with that CNC, whereas the old school machinist can work around some problems. The equipment is simpler, less efficient, but there's more slack, more margin for error. Centralizing around more complex equipment is the worst possible approach. We make as many people as possible dependent on machines and supply chains with a high probability of failure. It's done in the name of efficiency, but it's only more efficient when everything works perfectly. If we disperse production, the more advanced machines offset the loss of capacity, while the duplication makes any failures much less significant overall. But where the pursuit of efficiency creates the most difficulty for anarchists is when it's coupled with environmental issues. Let's go back to Cloak of Anarchy for a minute. The freeways served America for almost 50 years. Then modern transportation systems cleaned the air and made traffic jams archaic and left the nation with an embarrassing problem: what to do with 10,000 miles of unsightly abandoned freeways. In some schools of modern anarchism, there's an idea that our cities are capitalist machines. People work in the city, but they live miles away in the suburbs. They get all their food and goods from big box stores, often miles away from their homes, and those stores get everything delivered from outside. All of this depends on a massive network of multi-lane roads carrying millions of pollution-spewing, resource-hogging vehicles that are also a significant means of siphoning wealth out of workers. Car payments, insurance, licensing fees. Cars are a wealth sink for working people. This leads to an intersection between anarchists and environmentalists, arguing for decentralizing into interconnected communities where people live closer to where they work, where food is produced locally instead of being shipped around the planet. Sometimes this goes a step further into questions of efficiency. Huge swaths of people driving their private cars into the city center every day uses far more fuel and emits far more pollution than those same people all taking buses, for example. It shifts the view from the capitalist idea of efficiency based on finding ways to reduce costs and maximize profits for the individual company, which for a business may well be to use factories in China and ship goods over to California and then haul it to New York on trains and trucks. But looked at from a total economic system view, the supposed efficiency falls apart. A significant part of the energy and labor cost is eaten up just by moving things around rather than producing anything. It would be more efficient on a macro level, better for the workers and better for the environment to do things locally. A sort of neo-Kropotkin vision where people work locally, have a sense of community and know their neighbors, work shorter hours but also find their jobs more fulfilling because they're not slaves to someone else's profit motive. I'll admit, it doesn't sound too bad. Oh, right. It does have some striking parallels with the whole 15-minute city concept being pushed by segments of the global ruling class, people that are emphatically not anarchists. And that they use many of the same arguments about the environment and sustainability brings us to the realization that even anarchists sometimes try to serve two masters. We can work to maximize human freedom. We can also work to reduce pollution and consumption, end capitalism and replace it with something else, even go full primitivist and work to dismantle technological society and get back in tune with nature if we're sick of things like plumbing and dentistry. It gets a lot harder if we try to do all of those things together. If we choose to remake our cities into sustainable communities with skyscrapers transformed into hanging gardens, freeways into parks, and industrial farming replaced with countless mixed crop fields interspersed with homes and artisanal manufacturing, we can do it. But it would entail seizure of property, destroying private businesses, relocating families. It would involve planning committees deciding who and where, and they'll all be open to influence. It wouldn't be very anarchist in its implementation, unless of course it was a gradual process, multi-generational as a consequence of other, more fundamental changes in culture and values. The point of all this is that throughout anarchism's history, there has always been a struggle to articulate mechanisms for regulating social interaction, facilitating industry, dealing with crime, all of it involving compromises with the basic anarchist idea of no rulers. Whether it's exchange banks with their appraisers basically running the economy, or federations of producers requiring administrators of some sort, or the modern AnCap affinity for cryptocurrencies that are at present reliant on centralized network infrastructure to work, anarchism solves the problem of the state with structures that are suggestive of minimalist proto-state institutions. And that's fine, because the real goal of anarchism is not to abolish government, it's to maximize human freedom. Anarchists, probably more than anyone else, recognize that a functioning society depends on accepted rules of interaction. Today we rely on laws and hierarchical structures of control. Anarchists instead look to the moderating power of reputation and social ties. The framework holding society together is horizontal rather than vertical, but it's still there, with the goal of creating the minimal amount of scaffolding necessary to maximize the liberty of every member of that society by moderating the worst tendencies of individuals. In implementation, it's not anarchy so much as the Cloak of Anarchy, a mechanism of human interaction so minimal and so universally accepted that it becomes invisible, a weight so light we don't notice we're carrying it, which is not something we can achieve with political treatises and purely rational arguments. It requires a change in how we think about power structures and each other, and that kind of cultural change takes time. And I think it starts not with a revolution, but with a firm and persistent no, with a building refusal to feed mechanisms of control and coercion. The more those mechanisms demand taxes, obedience, conformity, the more we should ignore its tantrums and let it go to sleep without dinner. It gets weaker, we all get more self-reliant, and in the process our culture shifts to something that could allow for a genuinely non-coercive set of agreements to do things like radically rework how our cities are arranged or shift to some form of decentralized post-capitalist economy. Because ultimately, freedom relies not on laws and systems, but on us, on individuals and the culture we build and carry. John Adams said of the U.S. Constitution, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The general implications apply even more to anarchism. The absence of rulers isn't enough. We must first make an absence of the need for rulers. That doesn't mean that we all have to have the warm fuzzies and hold hands while singing Kumbaya. It just means that we don't use state force to persecute the people we don't like.